Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as head of the United Nations Development Programme, but also as someone who has for many, many years believed that it is in our cities, in our urban centers, where we both discover the future, we invent the future, both for cities, but also for our societies and economies. But we also draw on that which defines history, the history of urbanization, the urban spaces, the kind of accumulation of people that then gives rise to so many of the things that have defined the way societies have evolved over time. As we meet here today and with the theme of the future of, or the new face of cities and this multidimensional development perspective, let me begin by saying there is on our planet today an example for every kind of success and failure in urbanization that you could possibly think of. So first of all, I think learning from the past and the present should always be a departure point in thinking about the future, because also, not only at the summit here, but at Davos and in the United Nations and in so many capitals across the world, we are living through another phase where our appreciation of the prospect of another technology revolution is narrowing our perspective on innovation to a degree or an extent where we may lose sight of what actually defines in history the success of new technologies and innovations. Technologies are never an end in themselves, except for those perhaps who are inventing them, perhaps to those who believe in them as being something that is transformative to the human condition. But here at a World Government Summit, it is important to reflect on what is the role of government, which so often is seen as the antithesis to innovation, agility, and opportunity, creativity. But in fact, in so many respects right now, as we look at our future through the lens of the digital economy, of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and much of what it may still give rise to, we are reminded once again how critical it is that governance forms part of that era of technology revolution. Not to constrain, not to impede, but to do something that is fundamental also to this notion of people living together in urban spaces. They are not about the buildings, they are not about the water sewage systems, they're not about the underground transport system, the power they consume. They're a place where people are looking for a quality of life, for human well-being. And let's be honest, the history of urbanization is both an example of how that aspiration often is not met. Today, 1.1 billion people of our global population still live in urban slums or slum-like conditions. 1.1 billion people. So to many, this idea that the city is the great escape, the great opportunity, may or may not be realized. And the interesting thing is, this is not by some law of physics, equivalent to maybe the law of gravity. The difference in the way that countries, communities, cities have evolved over time is very often the product of a very deliberate way in which urbanization has been shaped. In the way that we are able to turn something that brings together people from many different walks of life, many different opportunities and conditions, into a shared space, and where human geography during industrialization taught us that inequality can be expressed very quickly also in urban geography. People who were poor lived downwind from the factories, because that's where air quality was bad. Wealthier people built their homes upwind. It's just a simple illustration. I'm also struck, I'm now a citizen of New York. I live on the Brooklyn side of New York City. And to me, it's been fascinating to learn about urban architecture. What you see today on the skyline of Brooklyn is one high-rise apartment tower after another appearing. After well over 150 years of that part of the East River, along the river essentially being a kind of industrial, manufacturing, storage kind of part of the city. And even more interesting, on the Manhattan side, 150 years ago, the buildings that were built by the riverside had no windows onto the riverside. In fact, they were bricked up because the East River was essentially the biggest sewage pipe out of New York City. And the last thing you wanted to do was to open the window onto the river and breathe in that air. Today, the most precious real estate in New York City is, apart from Central Park, actually riverfront property, because rivers are being cleaned up, because the environment around that marine context for New York City is an entirely different one than it was just 50 or 100 years ago. Why do I say that? Because in essence, the future of our cities is a matter of public choice, and then of technology, and then of investment, and many other factors. But I would like to begin this brief presentation by reflecting on the centrality of having the human being, that urban citizen, at the forefront of our thinking about the future of cities, whether it is infrastructure, transport, whether it is also addressing existential issues such as climate change. We have, in some ways, a very good example of how cities, by concentrating people on just 2% of land surface across the globe, in a sense providing us with an extraordinary efficiency in terms of land use. Imagine if we had that kind of sprawling urbanization happening in a city like New York today. But we also have 78% of energy consumption in our cities around the world today. So addressing a challenge such as climate change is inextricably linked to the decisions we make about powering our cities, the transport systems that we will develop in the future, the decarbonization, essentially the green transition of our urban spaces into the future. As the United Nations Development Programme, we don't hold a single view of urbanization. What we are today is a platform for countries, cities, local governments to rapidly learn from one another. And never has this been more important than today for three reasons. One, technology is a game changer wherever you look around the world today, whether it is the digital economy in broader terms, whether it is the emergence of artificial intelligence, whether it is also the way in which cities can create the economies of scale that allow the deployment, the diffusion, the use of technology to happen much more quickly. But it is also an opportunity to focus on another aspect, which is the issue of equity, inequality. If you look across the world today, apart from the environmental threats, the geopolitical and security threats, inequality, or put in another way, equity or the lack of equity, may be the most defining variable in terms of either successful societies and certainly of urban centers. Just the last few years have taught us a great deal that inequality has produced not only a degree of frustration, lack of trust in the central institutions of governance, whether at local government level or at central government level, but even trust in one another. Very often today, cities become the hot points of where political radicalization emerges, a product of alienation, of inequality, of a lack of attention to how people can share an urban space together. And so much of our work today does have to take into account that multidimensional character that is the centerpiece of our discussion here this morning, because if you simply focus on technology solutions, you are going to not ensure that these arrive, sometimes in an unequal society, with at least the prospect of reducing inequality. Now, the digital economy, the e-government platforms that we have in today's world have created extraordinary opportunities. We have reduced inequality, in part also by having made increasingly that digital platform accessible. E-government platforms are a revolution in the way public services can be provided, but also in the way that urban cities can be reimagined and that we can build on the future. Let me finally dwell a moment also on going back in history. Much of what is encapsulated in our cities around the world today is essentially history. History in the sense of culture, tradition, but also wisdom, sometimes the failure of wisdom to prevail, but also the capital on which we can build in terms of what cities can represent in the future. Thinking about the future of cities in today's world is not only to look to the future of possibility, it is to try and connect it to that social, cultural, psychological, may I say, the identity fabric of what defines a city in today's world. And that is a fundamental challenge both to development planners, because sometimes the shortest route to an efficient service or to an efficient delivery platform may not be the most effective in terms of where people would like their urban centers to evolve. And choices are often defined in strange ways. Some of the most ardent critics of environmental protection, of, for example, investing also in nature-based solutions, in maybe restoring ecosystems, and I think we will hear a little bit more about that later through your presentation, are often viewed by those who are amongst the wealthiest in a city as challenging their right to free decision-making. And yet, look for a moment at the price of real estate. To those who sometimes argue most aggressively against nature protection, conservation, and the green transition, are at the same time the people who will pay the highest real estate in order to be able to live next to a river in a city or next to Central Park in New York. But this is privilege deciding over the protection of nature rather than a fundamental appreciation of its social and economic significance, never mind the ecological implications of this. So I end my brief presentation this morning perhaps in a way that you might not have quite anticipated from the vantage point of the head of the United Nations Development Program, but I do so both with the conviction and the humility that the way in which cities will shape the future of our societies, of life amongst us as citizens, is as much linked to technology as it is to the choices that we enable people to make. Informed choices, choices that learn from history, including that pronounced and protracted inequality in an urban center will never succeed in creating a peaceful, harmonious city and path for future development. Technology holds many possibilities, but in part, their success or failure will be defined precisely by the kind of choices that we're enabling our citizens to make, and therefore also how governments function as protectors, as enablers, as regulators, and sometimes as those who are able to invest where the market is not yet ready to invest. Thank you so much.